Okay, another 7 rotations of this planet in relationship to the sun, and here we are. This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown. I want to welcome you, whoever you are, new person or old friend. I'm glad you're here. Thank you. And I hope that right now, while you're listening to this, you're not also doing other stuff online. I hope that you're having a walk or a run, or maybe you're working out, or maybe you're in your car driving somewhere. Maybe you're having breakfast. I don't know, whatever it is that you're doing right now while you're listening to this. I do hope that you're feeling okay. And like I said, I hope that you're not multitasking and doing other work like on another tab or in another window. I mean, if you are, it's okay. I'm not trying to tell you what to do. I do that all the time, doing multiple stuff on my computer at the same time, listening to something while I'm doing other work. But I'm kind of hoping that you're not right now, that you're just listening to this and not plugged into the internet in some other way at the same time. And I think the reason I'm hoping that is I've been reflecting on something this week after a conversation I had with a friend. They were talking about how I was off of Facebook and they were off of Facebook and avoiding the metaverse. And I was thinking about what we were talking about and realizing that in actuality, we're already in the metaverse. I'm already in the metaverse. If I really take stock, more of my waking life is spent plugged into the internet via a device than not. Some of you might remember for a while there I was trying to do like a tech Sabbath where I'd have at least one day of the week where I wasn't plugged in. Well, that hasn't happened in a long time. My eyes aren't doing so good. It's out of control. And the only difference between where we are now and where Zuckerberg wants to take us is they want to take us from the 2-dimensional internet we're on now to a 3-dimensional internet via VR goggles. So your avatar is now whatever you want it to be, and you can move around as it or whatever it is. And I realize that's like a immersive experience that's different than the 2-dimensional internet that we now enjoy. But it's the same thing. It's just adding this 3-dimensional immersive layer. But we're already plugged into it is my point. And I really feel that I need to try to create a better balance of my analog experience of time and life and my digital time that I spend, because the balance is way off right now, y'all. Way off indeed. And I'm sure I'm not the only one. And part of it is getting back to some in-person teaching, I think. I know a lot of you out there have already been doing that. Some people have been doing it the whole time, but many of us, I'm including myself here, haven't done any in-person teaching in years now, in over 2 years. And I am admitting to myself that there's a nervous anxiety about it. At this point where I live, things are such in the pandemic that I do think it would be okay for us to be having in-person classes together. And there are certainly some people I think I could email who would show up, and I just haven't emailed them yet. I feel a little bit of nervousness around that, which is kind of fun in a way, like it's all new again, like I'm a young teacher again. But really, I just think it has to do with weaning myself off of the comfort that I have found in doing online teaching. Last week we were talking about the blessings and the benefits of online teaching, and I think there are many. But it's also become a very comfortable thing for me now to just be sitting by myself with my computer teaching, which is definitely not the same thing as interacting with other human beings in the same room. And I feel like I need to have a little discipline to make myself do it, because I think it's essential. It's part of striking this better balance where I want to continue to have all this wonderful interaction in yoga with people who don't live where I live. I think that's where maybe this technology can be good and useful. But if that's all I'm doing and I'm not actually also connecting to people here, other people right here where I am, breathing in the same space together, then that's when my life starts to feel like it's tilted into the metaverse. I'm no longer having the same experience of life and of other people, because so much of my interactions with other people are now in a digital sphere rather than the ground in which we stand in actuality. So in any case, I'm just thinking out loud, I think, right now. But I imagine there are a lot of us out there who are pondering some of this stuff, and I think I want to set myself some goals to get back into the room with other people this year, definitely. But even in the next, I'm going to give myself 2 to 3 months. What do you say? Is that okay? By April, May, I'm going to really make that effort if I haven't already, because I think I might do it sooner. Again, it depends on what's going on where you are and, of course, your comfort levels. But last week I was talking about getting my daughters off of the masks, and for me, it's about getting myself back into a flow of interacting with other people in analog spaces. Speaking of experiences to counter our modern times, my guest today is Swami Saradananda. And as you will hear, our conversation was a result of my desire to discuss the Hatha Yoga Pradīpikā. Many of you know a few weeks back I started an online teacher training, and in the next few weeks we're going to be going into different philosophical viewpoints within yoga, and I wanted to see if I could have some conversations to flesh out what I think are different paths, different ideas of what yoga is and what the purpose of practice is for. So today is one of those conversations. Swami Saradananda shares with us what I think of as a very classical viewpoint of this text. And as you will hear, I think one of the things that we arrived at was a consideration of meditation and samadhi. And just looking at those two words and what they mean or what they might be referring to, I think is a very good vehicle for observing what viewpoint you may be most aligned with or not. In any case, it was a very interesting and thought-provoking conversation. I was very grateful to Swami Saradananda for having it with me, and I am glad to be sharing it with you today. Real quick before we do, I want to give a quick shout out to some podcast premium subscribers. Today, I want to say thank you to Danny Wiley Farwig and Michael McCabe. Thanks, Danny and Michael. I really appreciate that you have continued to support the show with your premium subscription. For folks who are new around here, if you don't know, the last 52 episodes of the show are always for free on the public feed, but the rest of the archives is part of a podcast premium subscription that we offer. It's choose your rate, cancel at any time. If you don't have money and you'd like to listen to old episodes, all you have to do is email us and we will send you a free account, no questions asked. But other than having access to the archives, it's really the way that listeners support the show. And we're just so grateful to people who do that. It really makes a difference. If you want to learn about becoming a podcast premium subscriber, or you want to find out about any of my other stuff, my weekly live stream classes or my on-demand videos or my blog or all the other stuff that I do, everything can be found at jbrownyoga.com. Okay, y'all, I think that will do for now. I will touch base with you on the other side. But let's go ahead and get into this. Let's listen to this conversation that I had with Swami Saradananda.
Hello?
Hi, it's Swami Saradananda here.
Hi, Swami Saradananda. Nice to meet you. I'm Jay.
Hi, Jay. Yeah, it's Saradananda. It's like the S in sugar.
Oh, thank you. I was just going to ask if I got it right. Saradananda with a sh sound. Thank you.
Yeah, you almost got it right, and it's amazing because people never get it right.
Well, I hesitated to try. I was just going to ask you to pronounce it first, but I thought I would give it a go. But I'm glad that you corrected me. I was going to ask. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
well,
I thought as long as we're recording, I might as well.
I appreciate that. And I was just going to say that as well, that Zoom tells us that we're already recording. And I do consider us already having begun. Is that okay with you?
Yeah, it's fine.
Okay, good. How is it with you today?
Yeah, it's okay. I'm in London. We haven't had any sun in weeks, but aside from that, it's okay.
That was going to be my next question. I have other friends there too, and they were mentioning that to me, but I guess that is pretty common for London. I understand we were also both New Yorkers at one time, though.
Yeah. Well, I've lived here in London almost 30 years, but I haven't lost my accent yet.
Oh, that's so you left New York much sooner, much longer than I did. But yeah. I guess I first want to just thank you. And I guess I feel like a little bit of apology might be in order. It's not too bad, but I realized that in my email invitation to you, I had some wrong information. For some reason, I had it in mind that you were coming from the Deskachar tradition, but in getting ready to speak with you, I learned that wasn't the case. So I'm still happy to speak with you nonetheless. And I'm sorry for that little bit of misinformation then in my email.
Yeah. Actually, I was listening to a recording you did with my guru by Robert Moses.
Yes.
Yeah, we were both at the Sivananda Yoga Center in New York at the same time.
Oh, okay. Now it's getting clearer. Well, just for you to know, and everyone who listens to this to know the genesis of this conversation, it happened primarily because of a mutual friend of ours, Alma Duran. We should give her a shout out. Shout out to you, Alma.
Yeah, I actually don't know Alma.
Oh, well, she knows you. She did a little bit of study with you, maybe online. And she learned a lot from you. She appreciated your teaching. And she is part of a teacher's Sangha that I do on Zoom for 3 years now. And I was talking to all of them a few weeks back, and I was saying, does anybody know anyone who can talk to me about the Hatha Yoga Pradīpikā? Because I was having trouble finding people who seemed like that was something they could engage a conversation with me on. And Alma said, I know somebody. And so I was glad that she put me in touch with you, or at least pointed me in the right direction. And I really appreciate that you took up the invitation and gave me your time today. So thank you.
Yeah. I teach a course every summer I work with an organization in Germany. Every summer I do a 9-day course there in the Haṭha Yoga Pradīpikā.
That's what she took, I believe, that exact course.
Maybe that's why. Yeah, because usually there are a lot of people, so I don't really remember all of the students.
Well, that's all right. I can understand that, especially if they're big groups on Zoom and stuff. But she certainly remembered you. And again, when I was getting ready to speak with you, I was getting excited because it does seem like we could have a good conversation about the Hatha Yoga Pradīpikā. I think Before we jump into that more, though, I am kind of just curious to ask you, I've spoken to a number of other people who were in the Sivananda organization for many years and then left, like you heard my talk with Robert. And I am just curious to hear from you about your experience of being in the organization for all those years, and maybe if you're comfortable talking about it, your decisions to leave it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I was there until the year 2000. I was there for like 26 years. And I traveled with my teacher, Swami Devananda, for several years. And then I ran the center in New York from 1980 to 88. And then I came to run the center in London, which is how I got to London originally. And I know there are a lot of recent allegations about Swamiji, whereas I didn't actually see anything while I was there. So I can't talk about that because I don't, I have no firsthand knowledge of it.
I guess I've heard that before, that there's, like with a lot of these, not I wouldn't say traditions, when the traditions came to the West, maybe that's the right way to say it, that there was an early period, like early in the 80s, and then things got much bigger later, and a lot of these things seem to manifest, or at least happen more later.
Yeah. Swamiji actually came to the West in 1957, quite before that.
Right, I know that, but I guess I'm suggesting that, like, the popularity of yoga into like a more mainstream culture in the West.
Right.
Where it kind of blew up and became something much different or bigger or something.
Yeah. I think that was, hippies did yoga in the 60s.
Right.
And I think there was sort of a thing where it wasn't as popular, but I think the real blow up in popularity was in the year 2000 and 2001, because I actually spent that year, 2001, I spent the whole year in India. And when I came back, I was shocked because I had only been away 1 year, and it's like things had changed totally. It was like really mainstream.
I mean, that's interesting. I mean, that when you use that date and you say 2000, 2001, that feels about right to me, because there was a period from then. I opened a center in 2007, and it felt like from 2000 to 2007, there was this big upward trajectory of popularity and everybody doing yoga. Right. So it feels about right. And what a trip to come back and see it off and running. What were you doing at that time? Were you running the center in London?
Well, I ran the center in London until the year 2000. So from 88 to 2000, I ran the center in London. But then I left the Sivananda organization in September of 2000, and I decided to focus on my own practice. So I just went to India, and I lived in a very small ashram in the Himalayas, and I just really focused my own practice.
And you don't want to talk about this, we definitely don't, but I am curious about why you made that decision after 26 years to feel that you needed to be on your own in it as opposed to being in community.
I was really sort of forced out. I had started finding, not about Swamiji, but about another person in the organization who was abusing people. And I knew from direct people reported to me, and I was on the executive board. And when I tried to do something about it, the rest of the people sort of voted me out. So, I was forced to leave. They didn't legally, officially voted me out. It was like, you give someone a job where they can't take it. You force them out, whereas they can't legally claim that you did. If you know what I mean.
I do. And that's such so you said earlier you didn't witness any abuse from Swamiji or I don't know if I'm allowed to say that from Swami Vishnudevananda, but you did witness some abuse, and it seemed like the organization had a not a way of like processing any reports of any of that, but instead of ousting anybody who says anything. That's not a good thing, I wouldn't think.
No. And I know it was interesting because when I was leaving, someone called me and told me, don't leave, because it's not possible to really do intensive practice unless you're living in an ashram. And I thought, well, if that's true, then I've wasted the past 26 years of my life. Because, if you work and you teach, you should be able to really do intensive practice anywhere. I mean, so that's why, that was one of the reasons I decided to just go to the Himalayas and focus on my own practice.
And I mean, what was that like after 26 years of being in a community and then leaving and going to the Himalayas? What was this ashram that you went to, this little place that you went to?
Well, it was a very small ashram. In the whole ashram, we were only 3 women.
Okay.
And we had no communal programs at all. Everyone just had her own room with a little, it was like a small, not really like a studio apartment almost, except that it was very basic. But it did face, I was like maybe within 20 feet of the Ganges River, facing it. And, but it was a shock because after living communally, and also when you're the person in charge, you have certain power. And to have no power, it was quite a shock. But I think the real power is like your own power, your personal power. So it was more relying on yourself rather than relying on your position.
I guess I'm curious, when you were there by yourself now, and you didn't have like the same rules to follow, did you stick to the same like practice protocols? Did you let it change? Like, now that you had this freedom to do whatever you want, what did you do?
Well, it changed because when I lived in the ashram, and for the last few years, well, like maybe the last 15, 20 years of being there, I was the person in charge. So I had a lot of administrative responsibilities in addition to teaching. Whereas now suddenly I had no administrative responsibility and I wasn't teaching. I just made a decision that I was going to just focus on my own practice. So my practice, rather than decreasing, it actually increased because I had more time to focus on it.
Right.
I know some people, said, oh, well, if you're leaving the ashram, you don't have to be vegetarian anymore. And, I thought that was really strange because, I was a vegetarian a long time before I joined the ashram. And if I was forcing myself not to eat meat just so I could be at the ashram, I don't think that would be a very honest thing to do. So, I felt like I had, rather than not having I didn't have the structure, but because I had been doing it for so many years, I had sort of built in the structure. And now I could increase it more rather than decrease it.
So I guess that's my question, but you were doing like the same practices that you learned at Sivananda on your own. You didn't like just, decide to change the practices up, but you're still kind of following the same things that you had learned. Is that right?
Well, I followed what I'd learned, but I think whenever you practice, you start to, it starts to change because you're working from your own experience now.
Yeah, see, I guess that's what I was trying to get at, because my experience when I became more self-practice, or even more like I met a teacher who at some point said to me that you should go in and determine your own practice. And that became a very intriguing inquiry rather than getting it from someone else or an external authority.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's good to have I think it's actually very important to have a teacher in the beginning.
Absolutely. I agree. Yes.
And by the beginning, I mean the first 20 or 30 years.
Yes, that's probably about right. I had been practicing for a long time before that happened. Yes.
Yeah. But I think that when you hear talks or you read books, you don't really know that what you're reading or hearing is true. Mm. But I think in a way it's like a scientist. A scientist reads and studies and learns theory, but then they start to think of it. They start to develop their own working hypothesis, and then they think, well, if this is true and that's true, then if I do this, I should get this result. And then the scientist goes into the laboratory. So I think it's the same thing with yoga. You study for many years, and then at some point you have to go into the laboratory, which is your own body and mind, and then you have to experience it for yourself. And from that personal practice, if you're a good teacher, you teach from that own experience rather than just, I read this in a book, which is how a lot of teachers teach, that, they just repeat what they read in a book or heard in a talk.
Yes, and sometimes if that book is a translation of an ancient Sanskrit text, what you're reading in that book might not actually be exactly what that text was saying necessarily. Who knows,
I meant to say, right? Even modern translations. I know now I'm writing books and, sometimes I see things they've translated into other languages and I know it's not what I wanted to say.
Interesting. Well, I know I saw in your bio that you studied and got a degree at SOAS, if I'm not mistaken. Did that happen after your year in India? How did you end up doing your studies there?
Well, because I live in London now, and then I found out about this course in SOAS, and I just thought it would be really interesting to look at yoga from another perspective. So I don't know if you're aware of this, but SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies, is part of the University of London, and you can actually get a master's degree in traditions of yoga and meditation. So I did that, and I got a master's degree, and I mean, it's not going to get me any more work, or, I don't really believe it.
Important to note that for all the yoga teachers listening.
But I found that I found it was very helpful because it introduced me to a lot of studies that I might not have looked at otherwise. It introduced me to a lot of literature. It sort of, it was I find it very helpful to look at yoga from another perspective. I think when you're in an ashram and you have certain teachings, you think this is the way everyone does it. And then you find out, well, it's the way your ashram, your lineage does it, but other people do it differently.
That's so interesting, because I think that I've sometimes been a little bit intimidated by that, like more academic viewpoint, because my yoga's always been more just observing my own experience. And I certainly have studied texts and stuff, but I've never been all that academically minded. But I think you're right. I know from just doing this show and talking to a lot of different scholars, my original ideas about yoga history and philosophies were oversimplified. There's like so much more nuance and complexity to it. And I think that scholarly viewpoint does kind of open up the lens in good ways, it seems.
Right.
I guess that might be a good transition for us to the Hatha Yoga Pradīpikā, actually. Speaking of texts, and I think it's interesting for me because it's one of the only texts that is really about Hatha Yoga, and yet Hatha Yoga become sort of the predominant aspect of yoga that took over Western culture, I guess, although I don't know if you can really call it Hatha Yoga always. But what I want to say about it is, I think that for myself, I never really have spent a lot of time looking at the Hatha Yoga Pradīpikā, because it always felt to me like it was rooted in a more like a dualistic idea about yoga that didn't resonate with me, that it was about like kriya yoga and like swallowing clots and purifying your system. And I don't know if that's like a very accurate idea about it. And I might have just jumped ahead. Wait a second. Maybe before we get to that, maybe you could do us a favor, anybody listening to this who's maybe not so familiar with the text. Maybe we could lay a little bit more foundation about it. Like, I know there's 4 chapters, but it's not like Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, is it? It's not like aphorisms and then commentaries. Is it more like what you might think of as a prose style of writing or something?
Yeah, it is a prose style of writing, and there are a lot of commentaries that you can get on it. But it's also not, I think there are a total of, 16 asanas, and most of them are sitting poses. But it does go in, it starts off with kriyas, and the first chapter is kriyas and pranayama. And then there's asanas and diet. And it does put quite a bit of emphasis on diet as well. And then it gets into mudras and bandhas and finally samadhi, because people think that the goal of Hatha Yoga is to keep your body healthy. But that's actually not the goal. You see, the goal is inner peace or samadhi. You see, the goal of all yoga is inner peace. But it doesn't mean that Hatha Yoga won't keep your body healthy, but that's considered to be like a side effect rather than the goal.
I see. That's interesting. You went right there too. It's hard not to go to the deeper philosophical place, but I guess first I'm curious to sort of maybe situate it in history, although I'm worried about that, because I think that's one of the things I've oversimplified. I think sometimes I try to like place these things in like linear history, but yoga's not linear, so it always troubles. But this text does come after Patanjali, is that right?
Yeah, but it doesn't relate to Patanjali at all. And Patanjali, even though people think he talks about Hatha Yoga, he actually doesn't.
It's like one sutra or something, right?
Well, there's one sutra, well, 2 really, on asanas, but all he says really is when you sit for meditation, your pose, your asana means pose or position, seat. Your pose should be steady and comfortable.
Sthira sukha, right? That's it.
Yeah. And that's all he says about it. So many people think that Patanjali, when he talked about asana, it wasn't the asanas that most modern people do. You see, it was those asanas really come from a more tantric tradition. And Hatha Yoga Pradīpikā is really in a more tantric tradition.
So you would say that Hatha Yoga Pradīpikā is more tantric, but...
Yeah, and it was probably about 1,000 years after Patanjali.
I see.
Patanjali probably wrote in, I think, the 5th century.
And that's so interesting, even the idea of 1,000 years, because I think about that. Sometimes when we talk about text, it's almost like they just show up fully formed or something. But these things develop over many thousands of years, it seems.
Right. Yeah. I think the latest estimate on the age of the Hatha Yoga Pradīpikā is around 1450. So that's like 15th century is 1,000 years later. So that's not that long ago. I don't know if we would actually consider it ancient. That was about 600 years ago, not quite.
Wow, that isn't that long ago, I guess. Although it is still long. It's longer than my lifetime, at least this one.
Right.
But
I guess, is it ancient? I'm not sure.
Honest answer. I guess, it does sort of, you said something just now about the goal being samadhi or inner peace. And I guess that is kind of where I was going before in terms of why I've always seemed to, I don't know, not resonate with the Hatha Yoga Pradīpikā. Maybe that's just because I haven't had a teacher that suited me for it. But it's a question that I've had a number of times with other scholars. James Mountain was on, and Seth Powell was on, and my friend Chase Balsart was on. And it was mostly about Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. And it was this question of, is Patanjali's Yoga Sutras teaching this idea of yoga that is inherently more dualistic, that it's about like a kind of transcendence of this worldly desire and suffering, as opposed to a tantric idea that's more like about an integration. And, there's many scholars who say, if you like look at the philology of the text and when it was written at that time, that it's clearly a dualistic text. But then you have traditions like the Desikachar tradition, which I'm very inspired by, which uses Patanjali's Yoga Sutras as like a primary teaching text. And they teach it not as this dualistic idea of yoga, as a much more kind of tantric or qualified non-dual or something kind of idea. And I think I guess my question with the Hatha Yoga Pradīpikā, I didn't get past those first chapters about Kriya Yoga because it seemed so inherently about this idea, like I have to purify my body in order to then receive the enlightenment or to get to the samadhi. And that just seemed like such a different idea about what I needed or what made sense for me as a Westerner. And I'm wondering, is the Hatha Yoga Pradīpikā inherently an idea about yoga that is this like ascetic kind of idea, or can it be interpreted in more like non-dual householder kind of ways?
Yeah, well, all the kriyas, I think, are maybe one of the most important practices at this time. I mean, everyone's worried about becoming sick, about, we're walking around with masks on all the time. We're worried about breathing things in. So why not cleanse your nasal passages? Why not cleanse your body in case you do pick something up? You see, so I think these practices are very applicable for modern people. And even before, the pandemic, I think that if you live in a modern city and the air is polluted, the water's probably fairly polluted, the food is adulterated. If you live or work with other people, if you go into a shop or you take public transport, sometimes in London, I'm on a train, the underground train, and, it's during rush hour and there are probably like 300 people in the same car with me. At least one or two of those people are going to have a cold, and that's in the air. So, I think the cleansing practices are very important for modern people.
Well, let me ask you something about that then, because, I did Kapalabhati breathing and Kriya kind of pranayama practices for a long time. And I don't do them as much these days. And I guess, I get what you're saying. Like there's like a cleansing of the air passageways and lungs through certain pranayama practice. I've certainly experienced like a physiological benefit. And I don't know if doing those kind of practices are going to be a way to combat viruses or not. But what my question is that it is rooted in this idea that the body needs to be cleansed, that the body isn't already cleansing itself, like it already has its mechanisms for doing that. And if I eat well and live well, then it's going to function in as harmonious a way as it can, given the environment that I'm in. But the idea that my system in some way needs to be cleansed is kind of what I'm getting at. That's an idea about yoga that's different than like a more non-dual of yoga, where your body is already functioning in its, intelligent wonder. It doesn't need to be cleansed in order to then have something happen to it or whatever.
Well, then why do you have to do asanas?
It's a good question, because it certainly provides facility and benefit, but not because it's like inherently needed. And in fact, as things become more integrated, it becomes less important.
Right. Well, the thing about yoga is there are many paths of yoga.
Right.
And no one says you have to take a Hatha Yoga path. There are people who, they just study Upanishads. And they study philosophy and they break things down and they analyze it. And other people go crazy if they have to analyze it, and they think, why bother? So I think people have different personalities. So I think Hatha Yoga is a path that many people have adopted nowadays and adapted it to modern life. And they've cut out a lot of the things, even though they're practicing Hatha Yoga, they've cut out a lot of important things.
I think you're right about that. And I think a lot of things, I've been talking about that a lot, about things that have gotten sacrificed in kind of the mainstreaming of everything. But I guess the question I'm kind of getting at is one that I've heard Birch write about, that there's this, even this idea of what Hatha Yoga is, or what the Hatha Yoga path is, that there's this idea of Hatha meaning force. And then there's this idea of Hatha being sun and moon. And I know that he's written about that, and that the Haṭha Yoga Pradīpikā that you're talking about, would that be more of the idea of Hatha Yoga being force? Or isn't the sun and moon idea the tantric idea? That's why I guess I'm confused. I guess within Tantra, there's all kinds of viewpoints as well.
Yeah, I think the word Hatha literally means forceful. And then I think later on, sun and moon means like it's the combination of opposites. So that, I think that came much later on. People started looking at Ida and Pingala, and how do you explain this to other people? Well, it's like opposites, like the sun and the moon, for example, or male and female, for example. You see, I think we can't take these things too literally. If you say left is feminine and right is masculine, well, but everyone has a right and a left. So we're not taking it literally like men and women.
No, but that would be more like idea of polarities or like energies in a system, more than like genders or something, Right.
But I'm saying also, when you start talking about Ida and Pingala and bringing the prana into the Sushumna, it's like we want to not have opposites. You see, so I think that's where the idea of sun and moon, it just was the idea of combining opposites.
But I guess for me, the reason why I get that I do think that's right, that inhale to exhale and male to female and sun and moon, it's about this idea of a harmony or a wholeness or an interconnectedness, and having an embodied experience of that as what you are. And that's a very tantric idea. That's the idea that I think of as an integration idea. But that idea of sun and moon and my breath and system all being in harmony and as one thing, that feels like a very different idea about yoga than this idea that I'm going to do these kriyas and austerities to purify my system so I can get to samadhi. And I guess I've been always just trying to parse that out. And it seems like those different viewpoints about yoga, they're expressed by whoever's translating whatever the text is or something.
Yeah, but I think you're misunderstanding the word forceful. You think it's something like harmful. But I mean, think of sitting peacefully and meditating as opposed to doing something active, which Hatha Yoga is. If you do asanas, that's an active thing. It's forceful. It's not just sitting and being blissful, sitting comfortably.
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of J. Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.